let's come back and keep the momentum and the dynamic in its continuity. As long as one has the illusion of an identity that founds one's own individuality, time is split by your present now into a past which is more and more dead, your history, and a future which everyone is busy trying to manipulate and shape already. You're going to live in my future. As soon as that identity begins to melt, the ego, which is the puppet master, becomes a little concerned. You are damaging my ego. This is not good for me. And those who think like me, it's not good for you either. We have to stop this melting and freeze it. And we're going to freeze it completely. We're going to freeze it by keeping the ritual comportment just the way it needs to be to keep identity from eroding and melting. And what's more, we're going to get it on the other side. To keep that ritual there, we're going to have really good laws. We're going to have doctrines that are incontrovertible. And we are going to have a society that ensures that this ritual basis and this society, our identity, the protection of our egos, the sanctity of the self is going to be intact permanently. And anything that threatens this is going to be annihilated. The bombings in Volgograd just recently, case in point. By the way, Volgograd used to be called Stalingrad. And when Stalin died in 1953 and they got rid of Stalinism because it had left the Russian population mindless. If you want to know how mindless it was, it's written up by the greatest Russian poet of all time, Yevgeny Yevtushenko. When Yevtushenko came to San Francisco in 1966, everyone was astounded by the incredible courage of the man, the greatness of his poems, and that he had been raised in Siberia by third-generation political prisoners who were sent to the imprisonment. You don't need bars in Siberia. There's nowhere to go for thousands of miles. And after their children got used to, after the Second World War, that they began to feel like it was an extended Russia. It wasn't just Siberia. And the grandchildren, after post-Stalin, they began to understand that it is the Siberians who are a new refinement of species, and they're not at all like those Russians who brought in the czars, who brought in Lenin, who brought in Stalin, and who brought in then the sense that it is about communism. Everybody's going to have the same ideology, and everyone's going to do the same waiting in lines, and all of this then was brought into questionability and contention. And Yevtushenko, especially in his short a precocious autobiography. Talks about the day that Stalin died in massive Moscow hordes of crowds of people in the big squares, Red Square, in front of the Kremlin. Stalin is gone. Big father. Never mind big brother. Big father. Stalin is dead. And he said, eventually the mindlessness of everyone began producing a chaotic milling of millions who were trampling people to death. And so Yevtushenko and some of the younger buddies from Siberia, they began to make human chains of locking arms and to spread the word. And it was only through the human chains of locking the arms in the hundreds of thousands of people in Red Square that brought to an end the trampling to death of people by mindlessness on a massive scale that was unbelievably vicious. Putin, responding to the bombings in ex-Stalingrad, Volgograd, said those responsible will be annihilated. Not just found, not tried, not even killed. Annihilated, which means anything associated with them, just like Stalin used to do. If you act up, everyone that knows you will be annihilated as well as you. Everything that you have done will be annihilated. And so this nihilism becomes an ideological annihilation. As William Faulkner, in his 1954 Nobel Prize speech, said, I decline to accept the end of man. That eventually there will be a paved planet with no protrusions to endanger the flow of traffic. And you will be able to stop anywhere and be fueled with gas and oil and food and nourishment and continue on your driving way. I refuse to accept the end of man as a planet of endless parking lot for the facility of endless traffic. There is something immortal about man, which comes out in his voice, still talking. Though it be alone in a whisper, it will be heard. And the ability to hear it comes through in the ability to write it, so that someone can read it and not just hear it. And learn to read and learn to write and learn to read and write in between all kinds of lines, and the rebirth of man comes through this not being intimidated by the blue meanies and emerging out of that yellow submarine and getting the music going again, getting the dancing in the streets going again, getting the joie de vivre again. Let's come back to the birth of the Mahayana out of Buddhism, where the bodhisattvas came into play. Asvagosha, when he begins the awakening of faith in the Mahayana, not method, not technique, not transcendence, not nothing. The awakening of faith. Why? Because faith has a resonance that comes with charity. And charity has a harmonic that comes with hope. Faith, hope, and charity. It's a triple winner. And this is how Asvagosha begins, and very quickly moves into the fives, the star seed, then moves into the eights, the octave, and then moves into the thrice greatest, the Hermes Trismegistus way of reality. For This is a translation of Ashvaghosha by D.T. Suzuki. D.T. Suzuki was the great Zen master of the 20th century. He lived to be 96, 97 years of age. And we have appropriate fanfare for the mention of D.T. Suzuki. His given name was Tetaro Suzuki, but Daisetsu in Japanese means great humility. And so Daisetsu D.T. Suzuki, who married an English woman, Beatrice Lane, and became Beatrice Lane Suzuki, who loved cats and kimonos and loved D.T., and they lived very happily together for a long, long time. This is his translation of Ashvaghosha, made in Chicago, published in Chicago in 1901 by the Open Court Publishing Company. For the purpose of awakening in all beings a pure faith in the Mahayana, of destroying their doubts and attachment to false doctrines, and of affording them an uninterrupted inheritance of Buddha seeds, I write this discourse. There is a principle whereby the root of faith in the Mahayana can be produced, and I shall explain it. The explanation consists of 5 parts: the introductory, the general statement of principles, the explanation itself, the practice of faith, benefits derived therefrom, which leads then, the introductory has 8. There are 8 inducements to write this discourse. And he goes through the 8, and in the 8th, he says, in an extension of the 8th, though all these doctrines are sufficiently set forth by Ashvaghosha, by D.T. Suzuki's translation and commentary, set forth in the Mahayana Sutras, because by D.T. Suzuki's translation, he understood that Ashvaghosha's awakening of faith, that Ashvaghosha himself knew there would be many other sutras resonant and harmonic to his own first one. Yet as the predispositions and inclinations of people are not the same, and the conditions for obtaining enlightenment vary, I now write this discourse. But there's a third reason, which is real. There is another reason for doing so. At the time of the Tathagata, in Sanskrit, Tathata is the word for, the best English word is suchness, or in the way that in Tibetan every sutra begins with evam, and in Tibetan evam actually means thus, such, thus, thusness, suchness. The Tibetan phrase in English is from evam, as the seed, is thus I have heard. Meaning that the first person to ever write this down exactly heard it exactly this way. So you, in not only reading it, but if you will read it out loud, if you will lift it off the page, those within hearing distance who have ears to hear will hear this fresh, original, not a reproduction. It's suchness. It's thusness. At the time of the Tathagata, gata in Sanskrit means gone, means suchness gone, thusness gone, means existence has been absorbed into formlessness, which is eternally real. At the time of the Tathagata, the people were unusually gifted and the Buddha's presence, majestic both in mind and body, served to unfold the infinite significances of the Dharma with simplicity and yet in perfection. Accordingly, there was no need for a philosophical discourse. In Sanskrit, a philosophic discourse is called a shastra. When presence shares, it is freshly real out of eternity. Not just now, but in its continuity, and as long as you don't obviate it with ego, with false individuality, with a delusional selfishness, with a illogical identity and identification as some kind of a norm against which everything must be measured and diced and filed. And after the nirvana of the Buddha, there were men who possessed in themselves the intellectual power to understand the many-sided meanings of the sutra, even if they read only a few of them. And so Ashvaghosha begins that quality, which is in an adjunct to what was current in the Theravada at that time, was the improvement of the Theravada to the Dhammapada. The Theravada, the elders' tradition, had become the truth path. And the truth path, the Dhammapada, is not in Sanskrit. It's not, especially in Sanskrit, in the Buddha's Magadhi inflection. He spoke a Magadhi form of Sanskrit in northeast India. One of the districts in the Buddha's home turf was Magadha. He was born in Lumbini, which is now in Nepal. The Dhammapada is written in Pali. Pali is the southern pronunciation of Sanskrit. It's from Ceylon. It's from Sri Lanka. It's the southern Buddhism, not of India, but into Sri Lanka, Ceylon, and across the Bay of Bengal, into Thailand, into Burma, into Southeast Asia. And so Pali became the language of the Theravada, uninterrupted by the Mahayana to a large extent. And so the monks, the Sangha of the Pali-speaking P-A-L-I, Pali-speaking Buddhism, are literally the conservatives, but speaking in a southern dialect, almost like the die-hard southern Christians who, in their baptismal conservative form, have forgotten one of the beautiful qualities of Southern baptism, which I'll talk about in just a moment. My father was a Southern Baptist. The conservative quality of that freeze-dries it so that no one can change an iota of the way it was written and read, and you must learn. The Masoretic text that the Rabbinic Council in Jamnia, near the coast of Israel, in 90 AD, exactly at the time that Ashvaghosha wrote The Awakening of Faith in the Mahayana, exactly at the time. Getting melodramatic because it is. that St. John wrote the Apocalypse on the Isle of Patmos. All these things happened at the same time. That the Grail was returned from the West Britain, Welsh, Irish, Southern Scottish terrain around the Irish Sea, returned back because the Grail carrier that always had to be a female of pure lineage, that female lineage, the mitochondrial DNA, was violated by kidnapping and a forced, not a marriage, not a remarriage, but a forced concubinage, and sent her husband, who was the king of the Fisher Kingdom. He was the Fisher King of the Irish Sea. And his name, in Scottish it's spelled L-E-I-R, King Lear. In English it's spelled L-E-A-R. In Welsh it's L-L-Y-R. In West Britain sometimes it was just called L-E-R, Lear. His wife's name was Penardin. She had 2 sons and a daughter. The daughter's name was Bronwyn. Her oldest son's name was Bran. And Manyweedwen, with a Y, was the second son. And when Bronwyn died of a broken heart, she was married to the King of Ireland. And whispers at his court made her an inverse Cinderella. So that instead of being the queen of the kingdom, she became the dishwasher and seamstress, mender of everyone that had to have something patched or washed. And she trained a little sparrow, an Irish sparrow, and sent it off with a message on one of its legs. And it's made its way across the Irish Sea to the Isle of Ainsley, where Bran had a part of his kingdom from Wales. There's still Bran's Hill in Wales. It still exists. It has the ruins of his ancient fort there, some almost 2,000 years ago. It's all true, folks. And when Bran led an expedition in to rescue his sister and killed many of the Irish nobles who had done this, she died of a broken heart in the north of Wales because of having been the cause of so much. And she died especially because her son had been thrown into a fire held by the feet of the nefarious one of the twins born to her by her abductor in concubinage, in order to end any kind of future for them. He threw the baby into a fire and she died of a broken heart. And that ended the Grail lineage of the women of wisdom whose mitochondrial DNA went back to Mary the Mother, intact, in the 5th generation. That Grail was returned in 90 AD, and because St. John was in exile on the Isle of Patmos, it didn't stop there, but went past Ephesus, where they had come to let him know what had happened, and went on to Antioch, where the Grail was put into a sheath, and the Grail still exists. And as we go through the Parayana, we'll talk about where it is and why it's not even recognized anymore like anything else that is real. It is time for the Parayana. It is time to understand that it is not a truth path. There is a quality to a path that it is superb when it comes to an integral. The most outstanding physics theory in the 20th century was Feynman's path integral. But in order to give a quality that one would not become confined by the path integral, Feynman devised for the first time a completely new language, a written language that could not be imaged in an integral way at all, could not be given a discourse. In integral-only language, he devised Feynman diagrams to illustrate, to express, to explore that the path integral is like a spinal column. It sets up the skeleton, but to flesh it out takes something more, and to give it the spirit, presence, it takes a whole lot more. Then you have to come away from the blackboard, and as Feynman did, went to his bongo drums to get in touch with the rhythm, that it is instantly, spontaneously present, and then becomes existentially parable, but the common denominator is that it's shareable like that music. It is an interesting thing. In the Zen tradition, the great transition from the 28 patriarchs of Indian Buddhism, who count among their patriarchs Ashvaghosha as being a later one, quite far into the 20s. Parshva is there also. And 2 patriarchs later, the great Nagarjuna, of whom we will talk much more about in extenso during this 2014 Parayana year. But when the 28th Indian patriarch went by sea in the 3rd century, the 300s, the 4th century AD, late 4th century, coming into China, his name was Bodhidharma. And Bodhidharma, there's a Chinese beautiful illustration by the great Qi Baishi. It has the 7 sages of China. 6 of them are in one area of the boat, and Bodhidharma, like somebody poisonous, is in the other end of the boat, because he was someone who was relentlessly real, would not indulge or participate with a bifurcated, paired world, even on the best of conditions, on any conditions. And he went to southern China with a trading, sailing group, landed in South China, and went as a recluse into a cave where he sat staring at a blank wall. That staring at a blank wall with this fierce eyes and bushy eyebrows and shaggy hair has become a characteristic ritual figure. In Japan, there are a couple of ritual figures. One is the cat with the raised paw that all businesses must have. One is the Jizo spirit that children's graves always have as a marker anywhere. And a third is Daruma. It is the fierce Bodhidharma that one has around to remind one that one has to do it this way. And in fact, the whole cult, and I repeat the word cult, the cult of Zazen, not Zazen itself, the cult of Zazen, that you can go to some kind of really comfortable retreat. Oh, some of them are really comfortable. And you can sit staring at a wall. Of course, you're paying for this privilege. It's like a rehab center, folks. And you have nice meals, you have a nice clean place, nice people to talk to. Gee, we're all doing Zazen. Oh, we can sit on Zafus and, The second patriarch in China, Huiko, in order to get Bodhidharma's attention out of his formlessness, cut off one of his arms and presented it to Bodhidharma. And so Bodhidharma, looking at him, passed that formlessness to him, so that it now could be passed, but it wasn't an it. And by the time it got to the fifth patriarch, Hong Jian, sometimes called Matsu in Japanese, he was old. He was in his early 70s. He knew he was going to pass on. He wanted to pass, and the way one passed the patriarchy was the bowl, which is like the grail, and the robe, which is like the unbroken robe after the crucifixion. The seamless robe, not just the empty bowl, but the empty bowl which receives what you need to live, not in duality, not in unity, but in formlessness, accepting whatever occurs. He was about to pass the bowl and the robe on to a very, very famous monk at the time, who in fact was sort of like the boss monk of the monastery, Shen Hui. While the Chan of Luoyang and Chang'an was enjoying this immense popularity and power, a then unknown priest in Nanyang, Shen Hui by name, was intent upon building a new school of his own. To this end, he launched an attack upon the Chan of Shen Hui's descendants, and after many years' struggle, eventually carried the day. The story of this new kind of Chan was unearthed by the late Dr. Hu Shi, who found among the Dunhuang documents housed at the Bibliothèque Nationale several manuscripts containing the sayings and writings of Shen Hui and his followers. These he collated and published, and through his studies rewrote the history of Chan during the Tang Dynasty. The career of Shen Hui fascinated this multifaceted scholar, who toward the close of his diversified life returned to the study of this champion of what became known as Southern Chan. Hence, Hu Shi's studies caught the imagination of both Western and Oriental scholars. A considerable body of material concerning Shen Hui has been produced. However, Shen Hui did not become the sixth patriarch. The kitchen boy became the sixth patriarch. His name was Hui Ning. On the eve before the passing of the robe and the bowl in the morning, late coming out of finishing off the pots and pans, Huinig read the haiku, the short form koan answering writing of Shen Hui, that by keeping polished the mirror in the mind, no dust will be able to collect upon it. And this was to be his triumphant acceptance of the sixth patriarchy and the triumph of Shen Hui. underneath it scrawled, Huineg, there is no mirror, there is no mind. Where could dust collect? Getting up early, Hung Jen Matsu read the scribbled, and he found out that the person who had written this was little Hui Neg, and he brought him in quietly to his quarters, gave him the robe and bowl, and said, now you better get out of town. They will be after you, because they're the power. They're the ones that control. The way that this situation is running, is run, will run. They're running because they know they're going to win. They've already won. They've got everything behind them. So Huineg left and surfaced later on. And this is the way in which in 713 AD, he was 73, he was going to pass on. Here's how the scribe describes what happened and what was said. Southern school, sudden doctrine, supreme Mahayana, great perfection of wisdom. The Platform Sutra, preached by the sixth patriarch Huineng at the Ta Fan Temple in Shaozhou, one role recorded by the spreader of the Dharma, the disciple Fa Hai, who at the same time received the precepts of formlessness. The master Huineg ascended the high seat at the lecture hall of the Ta Fan Temple and expounded the Dharma of the great perfection of wisdom and transmitted the precepts of formlessness. At that time, over 10,000 monks, nuns, and lay persons sat before him. The prefect of Shaochu, Wei Che, some 30 officials from various departments, and some 30 Confucian scholars all begged the master to preach the Dharma of the great perfection of wisdom. The prefect then had the monk disciple Fa Hai record his words so they might become known to later generations and be of benefit to students of the way, in order that they might receive the pivot of the teaching and transmit them among themselves, taking these words for themselves. When we come next week, we'll see how at the same time that Huineg was doing this, in India, one of the great last Buddhist sages, Shantideva, was writing his classic, the Bodhikaryavitara, now translated as the Way of the Bodhisattvas. It originally was the Way of Enlightenment. More next week.